I was only 21 years old when I married John, the love of my life. Everything felt like a dream when we first got married. We lived in a small town, and life was simple and beautiful. But there was one thing I never expected: my relationship with my father-in-law. John's father, Mr. Mwangi, was a proud man, a man of strong principles and rigid traditions. He was respected by everyone in the village and never hesitated to let others know how he believed life should be lived. He was strict, and he showed no mercy to anyone. I had heard rumors about him before I met him, but I never thought I would experience it firsthand. The first time I noticed something strange was after our wedding. John and I had been happily married for only a few weeks when Mr. Mwangi invited us to stay at his home for a while. It was a tradition in his family that newlyweds spend some time with the elders, seeking advice and learning the ways of the household. At first, I was excited. I thought this would be a great way to bond with my husband's family. Little did I know, my time at his home would be far from what I imagined. The first few days were tolerable. Mr. Mwangi would greet me coldly when I entered the room, and though he never spoke much to me, I assumed it was because he was a man of few words. But then, things began to change. One evening, I was sitting in the living room, quietly listening to the soft sounds of the village outside, when Mr. Mwangi walked in. I had been sitting by myself for some time, waiting for John to return from work. Mr. Mwangi looked at me with his sharp eyes, scanning me as if searching for something. "You should be in the kitchen," he said, his voice stern. "A wife should always be busy with her duties, not sitting idly around." I was taken aback. I had never been told what to do so directly, and it felt uncomfortable. But I nodded and hurried to the kitchen, determined to prove myself. However, things didn't get better. Every time I entered a room, he would barely acknowledge my presence. If I made a mistake, even a small one, he would scold me in front of everyone, humbling me to the ground. He never once spoke to me with kindness or encouragement. I had never felt so alone, even though I was surrounded by family. One day, John's younger sister, Grace, asked me if everything was okay between me and their father. "He's just hard to please," she said, offering me a sympathetic smile. But I couldn't understand why he was being so harsh with me. I had never done anything to deserve his treatment. As days turned into weeks, I began to feel like a stranger in my own home. There were many nights when I would lie in bed, tears streaming down my face, wondering what I had done wrong. John would try to comfort me, but he was often too busy with his work to notice the pain I was in. My father-in-law's harsh words and cold stares had become unbearable. It wasn't until one night, when John was out with some friends, that things took a turn I could never have predicted. I had been sitting in the living room, nervously tapping my foot, waiting for John to return. The house was quiet, too quiet, and I began to feel the weight of Mr. Mwangi's presence in the room. He had been sitting in his favorite chair, staring into the distance, as if lost in thought. But I could feel his eyes on me. "What are you doing here?" he suddenly asked, his voice low and menacing. I jumped in surprise, not expecting him to speak. I was just waiting for John to return." "Waiting for your husband, huh?" His voice was thick with disdain. "You should be doing more than waiting. You should be making yourself useful. There's nothing more pitiful than a wife who waits around doing nothing." I didn't know how to respond. His words cut through me like a knife, and I felt smaller than I ever had in my life. He stood up and walked toward me, his presence looming over me. "You've been here long enough. The room is empty, so why are you still sitting here?" he asked, his voice harsh. I didn't answer. What could I say? His words left me speechless, and I felt the weight of his judgment pressing on me. I stood up, my hands trembling, but before I could leave the room, he blocked the door. "Where do you think you're going?" he demanded. "You don't leave until I say so." I was taken aback. My heart raced as I realized that I had nowhere to go. I had no choice but to stand there in silence, feeling trapped in the same house I had once thought would be my home. The days that followed were filled with a stifling silence. Mr. Mwangi never spoke to me unless he had something to criticize, and even then, his words were harsh. It was as if he was trying to break me down, to make me feel like I didn't belong. I felt suffocated. I wanted to leave, to escape to a place where I could breathe, where I could find peace. But I couldn't. John had warned me that his father was not one to be crossed, and if I disrespected him, there would be consequences. So, I stayed. There were days when I would sit alone in my room, staring at the walls, wishing for a different life. I would sometimes hear Mr. Mwangi speaking in his room, but his voice always had an edge to it, as if he was speaking to someone who had wronged him. I never understood what had made him this way. One evening, after another long day of silence and criticism, I couldn't take it any longer. I had reached my breaking point. I needed to talk to someone, anyone, about how I felt. But every time I tried to reach out to John, he was too preoccupied with his work, or too tired to listen. It felt like no one cared about the emotional turmoil I was going through. I made my way to the kitchen that night, desperate to escape my thoughts. I grabbed a glass of water and sat by the window, looking out into the dark night. The village was quiet, and the only sound I could hear was the rustling of the trees in the wind. But then, the silence was broken by a soft voice. "Why do you let him do this to you?" It was Grace. She had been standing at the door, watching me for some time. I didn't have an answer. How could I explain the suffocating feeling I had when my father-in-law was around? How could I explain the loneliness I felt, even though I was surrounded by family? "I don't know," I whispered. "I feel like I'm drowning." Grace walked over and sat next to me. "You don't have to live like this. You deserve to be happy, to be treated with kindness and respect." Her words were like a breath of fresh air, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things didn't have to stay the way they were. The next day, I decided to confront Mr. Mwangi. It was a decision that terrified me, but I couldn't go on living in fear any longer. I couldn't let him continue to control my life. I found him sitting in his chair, just as he always did. His cold eyes met mine, and for a moment, I thought he might say something to discourage me from speaking. But I didn't care. I had to say something. "Mr. Mwangi," I began, my voice trembling. "I can't live like this anymore. I can't keep pretending everything is okay when it's not. You treat me with no kindness, and I don't understand why." For the first time since I had met him, Mr. Mwangi didn't immediately respond. He just stared at me, his face unreadable. I stood there, waiting, my heart pounding in my chest. Finally, he spoke. "You are right," he said quietly. "I have been harsh with you. But it is because I wanted to test your strength. In this family, we believe that a woman's strength lies in her ability to endure. If you cannot handle the pressure, then you are not worthy of being a part of this family." His words stung, but I didn't let them break me. I realized then that his harshness wasn't about me, it was about his own beliefs, his own way of thinking. "I don't want to be treated like this anymore," I said, my voice steady. "I want to be respected, and I want to be a part of this family in a way that makes me feel valued." Mr. Mwangi looked at me for a long moment, as if considering my words. Then, without saying anything more, he stood up and walked out of the room. Things didn't change overnight, but that day marked the beginning of a shift in my relationship with Mr. Mwangi. It wasn't easy, but over time, he began to show me more respect. He still had his moments of harshness, but now, I understood that it came from his own beliefs, not from a place of hatred. John, too, began to notice the strain in our relationship, and he started to spend more time with me, making sure I felt heard and supported. We talked openly about the difficulties I faced with his father, and he promised to do better. It wasn't the perfect resolution I had hoped for, but it was a start. Slowly but surely, I began to find my voice again. With each passing day, I began to feel a subtle shift in the way I carried myself. At first, the changes were small, no longer cowering when Mr. Mwangi entered a room, or avoiding eye contact when he scolded me. I started to hold my head a little higher, not because I wanted to challenge him, but because I realized I had the right to exist in his presence without being belittled. John had noticed the change, too. He started to spend more time with me, making sure I felt supported. He could see that I was growing more confident, and it made him proud. Yet, there were still moments when I would falter, especially when Mr. Mwangi's icy glare fell upon me, or when he criticized my cooking or the way I handled things around the house. But with each criticism, I reminded myself that it didn't define who I was. One evening, after another long day of Mr. Mwangi's disapproving silence, I found myself standing in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. As I prepared the meal, I thought about all the struggles I had faced in his house, all the nights spent wondering if I would ever feel like I truly belonged. But now, as I moved around the kitchen with purpose, I felt a newfound sense of pride. I was doing it for myself, not because I had to, but because I was capable. The door to the kitchen creaked open, and Mr. Mwangi stepped inside. My heart skipped a beat, but I didn't flinch. I continued with my task, not giving him the satisfaction of seeing me nervous. He stood there for a moment, watching me. His silence was heavier than usual, and I could feel the tension building in the air. "What are you making?" he asked, his voice still gruff, but there was something different in it this time, something softer. "I'm making dinner," I replied, without looking at him. "We'll eat together when John gets back." For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the knife slicing through vegetables. Then, Mr. Mwangi spoke again. "You've changed," he said, almost as if to himself. "I can see it in the way you hold yourself now. I may not agree with everything you do, but I can respect that." I paused for a moment, my knife hovering above the chopping board. My heart pounded in my chest, but I didn't let his words shake me. I had spent so long trying to gain his approval, but now, I realized that respect had to be earned on both sides. "I'm doing what I believe is right for me," I said, finally meeting his eyes. "I am not here to win your approval, Mr. Mwangi. I am here to be treated with kindness and respect, just like anyone else." He looked at me for a long moment, and for the first time, I saw something that resembled pride in his eyes. "Maybe you have more strength than I gave you credit for," he muttered, then turned and left the kitchen without another word. Things between John and me were also improving. We had many conversations about our future, and he began to recognize the importance of standing up for me, especially in the face of his father's harshness. It wasn't always easy for him to navigate the complicated relationship between me and his father, but we both knew that communication was the key. There were times when we would talk late into the night about how we could better support each other, about how we could strengthen our marriage despite the challenges we faced. It was during these late-night conversations that I realized just how much I had grown. I wasn't the timid young woman who had entered this home, afraid to speak her mind. I had become someone who knew her worth, who knew that I didn't have to settle for being treated poorly. One evening, as we sat together on the porch, watching the sunset, John took my hand in his. "I'm proud of you," he said softly. "You've been through so much, but you've never given up. I admire your strength." I smiled at him, feeling a warmth spread through me. "Thank you. It hasn't been easy, but I've learned a lot about myself. And I've learned that I have to fight for what's right, even if it's hard." John squeezed my hand, his eyes filled with love. "We're in this together, always." And for the first time in a long time, I believed him. As the months went by, the tension in the house gradually lessened. Mr. Mwangi, though still reserved, began to show signs of acceptance. He no longer demanded that I stay in the kitchen, nor did he criticize my every move. He respected the fact that I had a voice and that I wasn't afraid to use it. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. One afternoon, as I was sitting outside, enjoying the breeze, I saw Mr. Mwangi walking toward me. My first instinct was to brace myself for another scolding, but instead, he sat down next to me. "I know I've been hard on you," he began, his voice much softer than usual. "I don't always show it, but I've been watching you. You've proven yourself to be strong, and you've earned my respect." I turned to look at him, surprised by his words. I had never expected this moment, but here it was. The man who had once treated me like an outsider was now acknowledging my worth. "Thank you," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "It hasn't been easy, but I've learned that I deserve to be treated with respect, just like everyone else." He nodded slowly. "You're right. It's not easy for a man like me to change, but I can see now that you have a place in this family. And I won't make it harder for you anymore." From that day forward, things between Mr. Mwangi and me began to shift even further. He no longer held the same power over me, and I no longer felt the need to prove myself to him. I had learned to accept myself, flaws and all, and in doing so, I had earned the respect I deserved. Looking back, I realized that everything I had gone through had shaped me into the person I was today. I was no longer afraid to stand up for myself, to speak my truth, or to demand respect. And I had learned that true strength didn't come from others' approval, but from within. John and I continued to grow together, and while Mr. Mwangi remained a figure of authority in the family, our relationship had evolved into something more understanding. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for that, I was grateful. Through the hardships, I had found my voice. And in the process, I had learned that no one, not even a father-in-law, had the power to take away my worth. I had finally learned to stand tall and embrace the strength within me.